It is my pleasure to introduce two extraordinary scholars who I deeply admire and whose writings are helping us to better understand our world. First is Chiara Cordelli. She is Associate Professor of Political Science in the department here at the University of Chicago. Her main areas of research are social and political philosophy, with a particular focus on the theories of distributive justice, political legitimacy, normative defenses of the state, and the public-private distinction in liberal theory. She is the author of The Privatized State, published by Princeton University Press, which was awarded the 2021 ECPR Political Theory Prize for Best First Book in Political Theory. Rob Reich is Professor of Political Science and, by courtesy, of Education, and he is the co-director on the Philanthropy and Civil Society Center. He is also an author of prolific nature. Just in the last few years, his books include Just Giving, Why Philanthropy is Failing Democracy and How It Can Do Better, a title that mirrors the topic of today's discussion. He also worked with Chiara on philanthropy and democratic societies, and he has a forthcoming book with University of Chicago Press, no less, that is Digital Technology and Democratic Theory. And I'm going to turn it over to him as the first speaker. Rob?
Great. Thank you so much to Chicago and to Stanford for putting this together. It's a great pleasure to have a chance to speak with all of the people here and especially to talk with Chiara Cordelli. We are both philosophers, and I want to start just by saying that for any of you in the audience who work in the world of philanthropy, whether on the giving side or the receiving side in a nonprofit organization, we don't bring any particular, call it field experience to our inquiry. But of course, we do work at nonprofit universities that are historically reliant upon philanthropy and ordinary forms of charity for support. So on the donation side, we have some familiarity. We come to this philosophically, which is we aim to ask various questions that you could construe as provocations in order to kind of unearth intuitions that help to clarify the nature of the relationship, in our view, between philanthropy and democracy. We have different viewpoints about this, and that'll be part of the conversation we have in a bit. I'll begin by giving a short presentation, no more than 10 minutes, to give you a sense of my own mindset about the relationship between philanthropy and democracy. I want to begin with a simple story about how I got into this topic in the first place, because it's not as if I was sitting in an armchair doing what philosophers do, and it just struck me that I should write about this topic. It came out of a personal experience. Before I went to graduate school, was an elementary school teacher. Had spent a bunch of my time as a graduate student thinking about public education. And then when I was an assistant professor, I had my first children. My oldest child went off to kindergarten here in the Bay Area in the public schools in Palo Alto. And on the first or second day of school, my son came home with a pamphlet of information from the school district in Palo Alto that said things like, "Welcome to the school district. So happy that you chose the schools here for excellent education that we provide." And there was a separate sheet of paper that said, "We believe in Palo Alto that the school funding system in California provides inadequate resources to provide the quality of education we aim to deliver. And therefore, this year, we've decided that the expected but voluntary contribution of every parent of a child in the school district is $2,000 per child." And as a parent, I nearly fell off my chair. I couldn't believe that Palo Alto was asking for $2,000 per kid. And I thought to myself, gosh, it's so interesting that a relatively wealthy school district is asking for charitable contributions to support the public schools. And then I put my philosophy hat back on rather than my parent hat back on. And I said, well, East Palo Alto or Oakland or San Jose is unlikely to be able to raise $2,000 per child. Isn't this an example of charity that's worsening inequalities rather than remedying them, which is I thought naively is what charity was meant to be? Then I asked myself, I realized that giving to the Palo Alto School District was not giving directly to the school, but rather to a school foundation that had been set up in order to attract donations from parents. And therefore, parents who made a $2,000 contribution got a tax deduction for giving to a 501c3 nonprofit. And then I asked, as a political theorist, political philosopher, where did this thing 501c3 nonprofit come from? When did we start making tax deductible charitable contributions a feature of the law? And that's when I had a much larger project in mind. How did we get the policies that structure the philanthropic sector? Where did foundations begin and how did they develop as a policy arrangement? Tax deductions are good for some things and not for others. How do they actually work in practice? And so I started a much broader project to try to understand not how it is that donors should give money, but how it is we came to have the policies that structure the nearly universal phenomenon of charity and altruistic behavior. That's why, for what it's worth, the charitable sector looks different in different countries and in different places. It's not because human nature is different. I think human nature involves the inclination to be altruistic and charitable. The sectors look different because the policy frameworks provide significantly different arrangements for donors to exercise this kind of behavior. So that became a much bigger project in which I began to learn about the history of American philanthropy, this nation of givers and donors and doers, people who want to solve their problems locally rather than look to someone in authority to solve the problem for them. And I want to give you just a brief taste of the kind of frontal criticism I have to make of the way that philanthropy often works today, and then a brief redemptive story in order to get up and running a conversation with Chiara. So the criticism would go something like this. And we have this particular entity in the United States and in many other countries called the Private Philanthropic Foundation. The Gates Foundation is an example of it, the Ford Foundation, Rockefeller, you can keep going in time. And we've had an explosion in the number of foundations created, in part because we have currently massive and growing inequality. And so people with extraordinary wealth are creating foundations in record numbers. Foundations are a kind of peculiar entity in that they're extraordinarily unaccountable to the people they aim to serve. And let me explain what I mean by that unaccountability. If you create a company in the ordinary private marketplace, well, you have investors you need to answer to. You have competitor companies who are trying to put you out of business, and you have customers whose preferences or buying preferences you have to satisfy. In other words, if you don't satisfy your investors, the marketplace, and your customers, you go out of business. That's not how foundations work. Foundations don't have competitors. The Gates Foundation can't put the Ford Foundation out of business. There's no logic of competition that way, and there's no customer. Rather than trying to attract customers, foundations are besieged by people looking for their money. You have applicants or supplicants rather than meaningful customers. So there's no logic of accountability in the foundation world like there is in the marketplace. And similarly, in the public institutions, in the ways that our elected officials spend taxpayer dollars, well, we have an accountability mechanism there called elections. If citizens don't like the spending preferences of our elected citizens, you can vote them out of office at the next election. And so there's responsiveness to civic preference through elections. In foundations, there's no such feature. There's no electing who it is that runs a foundation. Family foundations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, like the Rockefeller Foundation, or all these others, are typically governed by the family members who create the foundation. So, to put it in a simple way, if any citizen of the country disagrees with, say, the educational philanthropy ambitions of the Gates Foundation, you can't decide to vote Bill and Melinda Gates out of office. There's no such opportunity for you to do so. The foundation just does what it does. And if you disagree with its preferences, what Bill and Melinda Gates will say is they're doing their sincere best to help improve public education, but with no mechanism of accountability, you're just left looking at their generosity as a kind of halo effect for insulating them from criticism. Okay, low accountability, very low transparency. On top of it, we have these tax deductions that mean that public dollars are being foregone in order to support the giving preferences of rich people. And then the final aspect of foundations I'd add to the puzzle here is that foundations by law are designed as a default matter to exist forever. John D. Rockefeller, who created the University of Chicago and still has the Rockefeller Foundation with his name on it, of course, is no longer alive, but his preferences have set the mission for the Rockefeller Foundation in perpetuity, which is to say, from a kind of philosophical standpoint, the preferences of dead people are governing the decision-making of people who are alive. The dead hand of the donor reaches out of the grave to strangle us, the current generation, and binds us to do what the dead person has asked of us. That's a rather strange way of organizing effective giving strategies. Final thing I'll add is that if you think, oh, Rob, you're spending all this time talking about big foundations, but what about the ordinary forms of giving that take place from ordinary people? I give away a couple $100 here and there. You probably do as well, maybe more, maybe less. And in fact, ordinary forms of giving are widespread in every society. When I did a whole bunch of research for this book and working in tandem with Chiara, one of the things I was surprised to discover is that if you have the impression, as I did, that most of charity goes to help the poor or the disadvantaged, it's a form of alternative form of redistribution or meeting the basic needs of citizens, it turns out that that's just factually false. The overwhelming amount of charity in the United States does not go to serving the poor or serving the disadvantaged. To put it slightly impertinently, given our hosts here today, higher education at places like University of Chicago or Stanford often are the popular forms of giving that claim significant amounts of philanthropy. Now, of course, you can give to Chicago or Stanford or any other university targeted for financial aid, but that's not always where the money goes, or it goes to a museum, or it goes to a hospital wing, et cetera, et cetera. If you have the impression that philanthropy's role in society is to provide for disadvantaged people, the facts on the ground will make you very disappointed, because in the most generous of assumptions about how much of American charity actually assists the poor and disadvantaged, you could maybe get to about 30 cents of every dollar donated. So this spells out for me a kind of disappointing story. You have the power of donors imposing their preferences through foundations in a tax subsidized manner, even after they're dead, upon the living. And then in ordinary charity, you have a picture in which, as I discovered as a parent in the Palo Alto School District, a lot of charity goes not to redress poverty or disadvantage, but actually in some cases to amplify it. The giving patterns in Palo Alto make worse the inequalities between school districts, not better. So you might wonder philosophically, what do I have to say then that redeems philanthropy? And the answer there, I'll conclude with, has something to do with turning this apparent vice of unaccountability into a certain virtue. I want to suggest that one thing that ordinary forms of charity, as well as larger forms of philanthropy by wealthy people, can do is serve as a beneficial, decentralized mechanism for pursuing the production of various public goods or attacking various social problems in ways that looks not to the government as the sole point of a solution or the marketplace for a solution, but rather to an independent set of assets, philanthropic assets, that have this distinctive characteristic. They can think over long time horizons. Because of the unaccountable aspect of foundations, foundations can take long time horizon bets on social problem solving, on innovations in social problem solving. And if we have a pluralistic array of philanthropists trying to identify and solve social problems over longer time horizons, we have a mix of different approaches, marketplace approaches, public institution approaches through the taxpayer dollars, and then philanthropic dollars that try in various ways to pilot new ways of solving social problems. And that could turn out, I think, to redound to the benefit of democratic societies, because democratic societies are by design harnessed to short time horizon decision-making. Elections happen every 2, 4, or 6 years. And the same place in the marketplace will punish you if you say, we have no prospect of any profit until 10 or 20 years. Losing money for a long time is not a recipe for success. Philanthropy can take risks in ways that the marketplace and government can't. And if it plays that role as a kind of pilot project for risk-taking and social problem solving, it serves rather than undermines democratic interests. That's my very short brief about a criticism of philanthropy and a redemptive orientation to it. And with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to my colleague, Chiara.
So thank you, Rob, and thank you everyone for joining us in this conversation, and for the University of Chicago and Stanford for organizing it. So I should start by saying that I completely agree with Rob that philanthropy, and especially I would add big philanthropy, represents a serious threat to democracy. But perhaps my reasoning here is slightly different. So I will first stress that this problem is independent of other ethical issues that philanthropy may also independently raise. So even if we assume, for example, say that philanthropists have the best intention, or that philanthropy actually could be the most effective means to achieve certain distributive outcomes, or even if we think that there is no injustice in the way philanthropists have acquired their wealth, still, I think a serious problem for a principle of democratic self-determination would remain. And this is because a principle of democratic self-determination requires that the authority to decide on the funding of essential goods and fundamental decision in a democratic society. So to what level to fund education, how to build a healthcare system, et cetera, all these decisions, citizens ought to have equal authority in making these decisions. So a society where the rich, however well-intentioned and well-meaning, has greater authority and opportunities to shape this kind of decision is necessarily a society where there is a second-class citizenship. And on this point, I would also like to signal a new book, The Tyranny of Generosity by Ted Lechterman, that has just came out with Oxford. A further problem, which also philanthropy creates for democracy, and that is independent of whether philanthropy is effective or not, is that I think in a society where philanthropy is called to substitute government in financing essential goods, philanthropy necessarily generates a relationship of domination. And by this, I mean that a system that relies on philanthropy in this way necessarily leaves some citizens dependent on the good unilateral will of others for the effective enjoyment of their rights. And this problem of domination, I think it's a serious one, right? The philanthropist can be benevolent, but it still becomes a sort of master on the will of whom the life of other peoples depend. And this is a concern, of course, that is very old in philosophy. Philosophers like Immanuel Kant have also discussed it. Now, I'm not going to spend time on this, but this potentially is a question that we might treat later on in conversation, that one could object, well, but anyway, dependence is always dependence. If we are not dependent on philanthropists, we are dependent on the state. But I think there are very good reasons. And again, I will leave perhaps a conversation about this for the Q&A or for later, but there are good reasons to think that dependency on a welfare state is qualitatively different from dependency on private philanthropy. So where do I, if at all, disagree with Rob? Well, first of all, I'm skeptical, but we can talk more about this, about whether it's really true that governments cannot take risk in the way philanthropy can. I mean, massive projects in history, like the building of railroads, have been undertaken by governments. We can think about COVID and what state did and had to do to face this crisis. And so we should want government to take risks. So I'm not in this sense in disagreement with Rob, but I would be skeptical in saying, well, government can't take risks, and so let's, philanthropy step in. But I have perhaps a deeper disagreement about an argument that Rob develops in his book, but less so in the presentation, which is, and it's an argument that we often hear, and is that we should have a government subsidizing philanthropy because philanthropy fosters pluralism. And pluralism would seem in this case to provide, right, two main reasons in favor of subsidies for philanthropy. So the first is that these subsidies would assist individuals with minority underrepresented preferences in overcoming collective action problems in the production of certain goods, whether this could be education, childcare, healthcare, etc. But my perplexity is that if such goods are required by justice, it is not clear to me why the state itself should not provide them in a diversified and pluralistic form. But if instead the provision of these goods is not required by justice, right? It's a mere question of, trying to fulfill people's preferences, then I don't see a reason why a liberal state should use the coercive apparatus of the state to force some people to pay taxes to subsidize the preferences of other people. So I'm skeptical about arguments that use philanthropy as a way of fostering this sort of pluralism. But my deepest objection, and this leads me to the sort of concluding part of the paper, is that an argument from pluralism, and I think the forward-looking argument that Rob makes trying to redeem philanthropies, neglects a fundamental fact, which is that in a world characterized by massive inequalities and the under-provision by government of certain justice good, we cannot simply assume that what philanthropists own is rightfully their own. So why not? Well, I think in a context where the government fails to meet basic demands of justice, right, and leaves this task to philanthropy, there are two reasons to be skeptical about the fact that what the philanthropy has in their pocket is rightfully their own, right? One reason is that this kind of society seems simply to compromise the very rationale that arguably justifies property rights in the first place, and which is to secure condition of reciprocal independence, right? As an individual, I need properties because I need to pursue my ends, not being subject by the mere whim of others, so I need my independence. But again, a society characterized by massive inequalities and distributive injustice denies people precisely that independence because it makes them dependent on the will of goodwill in philanthropy. So in this society, we should think that the very justification for property rights starts collapsing. And so that the wealthy cannot claim full property rights over their entire wealth. And also there is a second reason. I think we shouldn't think about property as a natural right. We are not born with property, right? Property is the result of political institutions, and what I rightfully own as a citizen is what remains in my pocket after just fair distributive institution have decided what is that I can rightfully own compatibly with the equal claims of others, right? But if that's the case in an unjust society, I cannot claim a full property right over what is in my pocket again. So what's the implication of all this? Well, it is massive. First of all, we cannot, conceptually speaking, there is no philanthropy. If what you give is not your own, right? The act is the act of repaying a debt. It's not an act of philanthropy. It's the act of giving back what is rightfully of someone else rather than yours. And this has very important implication for how we should understand the discretion of philanthropists. Philanthropists should not give as if what they give is fully their own, and therefore they should not give according to their personal preferences, according to their idiosyncratic understanding of what an important cause is, but rather the decision about how philanthropic donation ought to be directed should itself be democratized. And so I think an important argument for the democratization of philanthropy itself, for example, for including beneficiaries in decisions about grant making, is not that the beneficiaries have a right to determine the direction of giving according to their own preferences, because they don't, but the fact that including them could be a way to at least mitigate that kind of dominating powers that otherwise philanthropists are left with, and is a way of including the beneficiaries in giving to the beneficiaries the power to determine the nature of the debt that the philanthropist is called to repay, right? What is that is rightfully their own, and therefore to what direction should philanthropy gifts be spent. Now, this may sound far too general, but I think, again, the important point is that we cannot ask what philanthropy should be or how philanthropy should behave without thinking seriously about the background context of distributive inequalities and property rights. Thank you. I leave now. I let Rob now respond.
Great. Well, I'm going to try to do what I hope will be a productive form of exchange between us before we move to Q&A by saying I think Chiara's raised three different kinds of questions. Well, the first is about, aren't democracies also capable of social problem solving over longer time horizons that are risky? The second is about asking questions of pluralism and the function of the nonprofit sector, a civil society, in providing for various forms of tax subsidized support for what turn out to be minority preferences, and how to think about pluralism as a justification for philanthropy. And this third thing, the most important one, the most thoroughgoing in certain respects, about in background conditions of significant inequality, we have to call into question the property rights of what people have currently into question, and therefore the discretion of someone to do philanthropy. What you said rather strikingly, Chiara, conceptually, philanthropy doesn't even come into the question because people don't have rightful title to the resources they wish to donate. So let me begin with that last one, because that's the most thoroughgoing type of criticism, I think, on the table right now. Given our undeniably current forms of inequality in many different societies, massive and growing wealth inequality in particular, a second Gilded Age is a fair description of it. Do you think that anyone who's wealthy, there's a stink to their wealth, that it's in certain respects an illegitimate pile of money they have? Is there no such thing in the contemporary moment as a person who has rightful title to the wealth under their current, bank account or description?
So that is a great question, and I think it allows me to clarify what is an important point. So many of the people perhaps in the audience have read this book, which was a New York Times bestseller by Anand Giridharadas, who was very concerned about the tainted origin on many big philanthropists' money. And so he grounded his criticism about the way philanthropists nowadays conceive of themselves as agents of social change, and they should actually step back and let a democratic public decide. And one of the concerns he raised is precisely that actually philanthropy is used as an ideological means to hide and mask the unjust acquisition of this wealth. Now, that might be true, but my point is much more concessive than that. I don't need to think, and I'm not, to some extent, not even interested in whether and who exactly of all the philanthropists acquired their money, how. It's not a question of blaming people, although some people may deserve to be blamed, but it's not a question of blame or necessarily of having stolen money, or it's a question though of the fact that we can be liable for certain injustice without being blameworthy for it. And what does that mean? Well, it means that the fact that I might not be the rightful owner of what I own might not have anything to do with my bad intention or something that could attract blame, but simply might have to do with the fact that I am a member and to some extent, therefore indirectly complicit in a society that has distributed the fruits of social cooperation unfairly. Mm-hmm. And as the winning party of this unfair distribution, I might have happened, perhaps even involuntarily, I might have happened to benefit from this unfair distribution. But if I continue, right, to benefit and perpetrate the situation and do nothing to change it, then I become complicit in a deeper sense. I start contributing to the injustice. Yep. But even if I do not contribute to the injustice, I have a duty toward my fellow citizens to repair an unjust relationship because we are members of the same society. So there are many ways and many levels of complicity. Not everyone has to be guilty, but the fact remains that if you live in an unjust society, you cannot claim full rightful ownership on your wealth, and that has the implication that that I mentioned earlier. So
let me ask Chiara. I want to try to imagine possibly some of the people listening are inclined to agree that background conditions of inequality are a significant injustice. And perhaps philanthropically, they've thought they'd like somehow to do something to redress that, in addition to doing whatever they might do as citizens, which is, voting for candidates for office who also wish to change policies. Okay, so we're now not talking about the Sackler family. They've earned the money in a way that harmed other people, and now they want to be do-gooders. Or the example, the philosopher is inclined to give of a stink in the fortune. Possibly I heard this initially from you, Chiara, like if I come and steal your watch and then I bring it down to the pawn shop and get a bunch of money for it, and then I give it to the most effective charity in the world that improves people's lives, and you come to me and say, hey, you stole my watch. And I say, but look at the good that the money has done in the world. That does not in any way immunize me from your complaint. I owe you some repair. Okay, so we're not talking about people who stole something and gave it away for good. We're not talking about the Sacklers who harmed others in money making. We're just talking about the ordinary person who is somehow liable to repair a background injustice that makes them a beneficiary of this background distribution, that they became wealthy, and other people disadvantaged in the distribution. All right, so now the person says, I'm voting for candidates who want to repair this. I want my philanthropy also to repair this. What is the philanthropist supposed to do? Hand the money to the government in taxes, invest in political campaigns, give money to political campaigns, renounce their wealth and put it somewhere? How does your view cash out for an individual who's inclined to agree with the background diagnosis and wants to know, what should I do?
So I have a question about the Sackler family, but before I answer yours. So I think the answer is both. I mean, of course, these are situations where everyone then has to use their own moral judgment. But the way I also try to explain it in my book is that philanthropy has to be used in a way that tries to overcome those very conditions that make it necessary.
Yes.
So the philanthropist has to act so that the world becomes such that we don't need philanthropy anymore, right?
Right.
So definitely the first, most important ethical duty, I think, is to push for institutional and political reform, not to act as the savior, as the substitute of government, of someone who even increased distrust or mistrust in government, even when governments deserve to be mistrusted. There is the sense in which governments can change, and so things ought to be able to improve, and history has shown that. The fact, however, remains that there are needs that cannot wait that kind of institutional transformation. So if I am a 5-year-old child, I need a certain kind of childcare now. If I am a pregnant woman, I need a certain kind of services now. So philanthropy, there is a principle that we may call the principle of damage limitation, that provides, I think, strong reasons to add to political advocacy also a kind of philanthropy that is directed to the actual satisfaction of urgent and time-sensitive needs.
Yeah.
However, the philanthropy, again, should not by themselves decide what those needs really are, so how is better. But there should be a democratization of philanthropy, because ultimately the philanthropists have no legitimate right to decide for themselves the nature of the social debt. But I wanted, I mean, the famous, this is a question, of course, that has circulated a lot, and feel free also to, if you want to continue this conversation, to skip it. But I was really curious, because I don't know your precise view on this, when there was this big scandal about the Sacklers donation to the Harvard Museum, and ethicists had different views about that. Should Harvard give back the money? Should they accept them? Should they? What's your view about those kinds of cases concerning tainted money in universities?
Well, I think the easier answer to a part of that question is that for current and future donations, any prospective recipient should really be, restrained or perhaps blocked from accepting the money because of what we know now about the Sacklers. For organizations which had received Sackler money, whether or not they should somehow divest themselves of it is a more complicated question, although it does seem to me wholly reasonable to decide to take the name off the building in order not to lend additional social legitimacy or acclaim to a name which has now been tarnished, even if only out of self-interest for the nonprofit organization now affiliated with the tarnished name. I think in keeping with your view, the kind of conclusion I've reached, what kind of philanthropy should the world accept from the Sacklers now? There's one answer only. If the Sackler family wants to donate money to organizations fighting the opioid crisis, or nonprofit organizations that are offered it should accept that, but not anywhere else. The money should go to repair the harm that they had created in making the money in the first place. Is that your view?
Yeah, that was my view. That is my view. And there was, I think, in the Harvard case, a complication because it seemed, I think, that they couldn't divert the money, if I remember correctly, without the consent of the donor.
Yeah.
And an interesting question, I think, of course, the taintedness of the money seems to me is a sufficiently strong consideration to consider the consent unnecessary, and so that the university itself should take for themselves the right to divert the money to a reparative.
Chiara, I think we should move to audience questions in just a minute, but let me ask one last thing that I want to be able to figure out in your view, and I'm guessing it's on the minds of lots of people here too. No one has, on your view, given current background conditions of inequality, the title or the standing to exercise discretion in trying to provide for the basic needs of people. That's something that we ought to try. Philanthropists should try to eliminate the very need for philanthropy in the first place. Okay. How does that work in global circumstances rather than looking to the state of which we are already a member? Given global inequalities and the absence of a single global state or institutional design to appeal to, how should philanthropists think about their efforts to target global poverty or global disadvantage when there's no clear collective solution that's on offer?
Yes, that is I mean, it's a very difficult question because there are certain, I think, ethical reasons that make the urgency to donate to global causes, such that you might think certain of these causes, some of these causes ought to have priorities. But then I think there is something about the fact that, one, in terms of responsibility and liability, being a member of the same kind of democratic political society generates a kind of perhaps liability on the part of the single citizens. I'm not talking about politicians who might have voted to, on policies that had direct implications for, of course, foreign countries, but the single individual as a kind of complicity for the injustice of their domestic institution. And their level of complicity is perhaps not the same when we think about the relationship between the single, Italian or French person in relation to, other kind of other countries. So there is one question, the complicity is stronger at the domestic level. And also at the global level, my fear is that the democratization of philanthropy that I see as necessary means to mitigate the problem of dependency and domination is much more difficult to achieve.
Yeah.
And so, although the urgency of certain needs ultimately may trump all these in some desperate situation, I think there are strong reasons for sometimes maybe focusing on the local rather than the global. And one is to try to legitimize, giving through these more local democratic mechanisms. So these are some general considerations. Do you have something else you would like to?
Well, I want to offer up one last thought, and then we'll turn the floor over to Emma, which is that, anyone who comes from the world of philanthropy, or perhaps anyone listening from the world of philosophy, is familiar with a rather niche movement, but that's attracted a lot of attention, called effective altruism. And effective altruists are looking to maximize the good that they do in the world, and typically, insofar as they care about people currently living, want to direct attention to the most desperately poor people in the world. And as far as I understand effective altruists, if you could take a kind of, a fire hose that contains human welfare in it, or, like utility units, if you could, as an effective altruist, just spray utility or human welfare on poor people across the world, and it would actually make them better off, of course we should do so, even if they have no part in the solution. They're just showered with somehow benefits, like spray COVID vaccines across the world, and people are better off in virtue of getting them. The emphasis that you have on the insistence on avoiding domination, you make the exception for urgency, really urgent cases, maybe we can tolerate some domination, philanthropic domination even. I myself I don't want to endorse the whole effective altruist orientation, but I can gain some sympathy with it, because at least if I'm trying to figure out what I can do as an individual here and now, I can identify desperately poor people. I might be able to identify effective organizations that can help them. They won't ever meet the criteria that you set out, like collective means of meeting the basic needs of people with background justice in place. And I have some sympathy with that, and think that there's some space for global philanthropy in light of it. Finding poor people and helping them now, even at risk of dominating background structures.
Yeah, we should open up the Q&A. Just two very quick points on this. The first is that the effective altruists, I just wanted to notice that, because they are the most, if you will consider the most progressive strand of philanthropy. Right. but I think they're guilty of the sort of the same orientation that I was mentioning at the beginning, which is the effective altruists conceive of philanthropic giving as a private investment.
Right.
So you ought to be generous. You ought to be extremely generous. But the assumption that is still that the money you're giving are fully and entirely rightfully your own. You have nothing to do with background injustice. You have no complicity. You just ought to try to be as generous as you possibly can in a very effective way. So, and I think that orientation is just wrong, and it also occults, obscures certain important facts. But another thing on this is that, so in philosophy, there is this example that, and I mentioned this because it's not my own, but I think it's very effective, right? Imagine a colonial power that was extremely effective at providing welfare. Imagine that if Canada took over the United States, they could, immediately set up a great universal healthcare system. I'm not saying that we shouldn't discuss whether there would be very good reasons, but I think there would be a strong resistance. And what is the resistance? Well, it is democratic self-determination. Mm-hmm. Things would be better, but we do not want only things to be better. We want to be agents of our own future. And right. So urgency cannot be neglected, but I think I will press on this point, right? Self-determination matters beyond outcomes.
Good.
And so that's an important point.
Emma, let's get you into the conversation so we can get the audience into the conversation.
Great. Yes, lots of questions. Okay, the first one. Since local, state, and federal governments in this nation do not adequately fund public services and other social welfare benefits that are givens in other countries, why would we ask philanthropy to fund innovative solutions? For instance, there is nothing particularly innovative about child care for all, and yet it is a key anti-poverty measure and allows full participation in the labor market. I would argue that philanthropy can provide large monetary donations to support public child care centers as opposed to an innovative solution. What sort of innovation is really needed in this case?
Yeah, I'll start there, Chiara, if that's okay. I think that's a great question. If there is a clear solution on offer, we don't need any innovation. Well, the philanthropist should just put the money to the effective solution on offer. And perhaps even if in Chiara's framework, and for what it's worth here in mine too, ideally it would be collectively provided through the state. So that would be my answer to this question. It would be, I can see a reason why we should take off-the-shelf opportunities, funding childcare centers, funding this local soup kitchen, and meet the basic needs of people, whether it's through the state or through philanthropy. But as Chiara has said, I think the aspiration ought to be that the philanthropist should make the meeting of basic needs no longer the task of philanthropy in the first place. And in the mode in which the philanthropist takes up the offer to fund the childcare center, the state recognizes, oh, look, this is being taken care of by some philanthropists. We don't need to do this anymore. And this isn't exactly a hypothetical. In California, during the 2008 financial crisis that followed, the California state government defunded public libraries and invited philanthropists to step up and to fill the gap. And when they did in some places, the state funding never returned. If you can find a way to outsource it to philanthropy from the perspective of the state, that turns out to be preferable from a taxpayer, political orientation. So as usual, it's complicated.
Yeah. And if I may add, and this is actually a point that Rob mentioned many years ago in an excellent article on education and philanthropy, and I think it could be extended to childcare centers too, is that, of course, the difference between also philanthropy and taxation is that taxation is at least in principle, ought to be run by a centralized system that cares about question of equity and equitable distribution, and whereas philanthropy, we may think that even only psychologically, a philanthropy is inclined to give to places that are near to them or with which they share personal histories and experiences. And this creates a problem, of course, of inequalities, where some childcare centers positioned within certain location may get much more funding than other childcare centers. And this is, I think, also an important concern to be kept in mind.
Great. So our next question, I recently saw a suggestion that if a donor accepts naming recognition for a large gift, naming a gallery at a museum or a faculty chair at a university, they should be denied a tax deduction. What do our presenters think about that?
Chiara, you want to start with that?
Yes. So first of all, I'm not sure philanthropy should be, well, it's complicated, the question whether there ought to be tax deductions for philanthropy in the first place, for two reasons. The first, if you buy a philosophical argument that the money the philanthropists give is not fully rightfully their own, there is really no reason why you should also, to restitute money that are not your own, you should get a tax deduction. So if my argument is correct, the case for tax deduction is weak. But if you leave aside that argument and do not agree, the problem with tax deduction often is that if the taxation system is regressive, then you effectively end up subsidizing more the donation of the wealthy as opposed to the donation of the poor. And so there is a question of distributive inequalities. But leaving all these problems aside, I think that encouraging anonymity, I mean, going to the main point, encouraging anonymity would mitigate some of the problem that philanthropy creates, both in terms of dependence and in terms of potentially using philanthropy as a reputation laundering mechanisms to clean up one's reputation in the public spheres, and as an ideological means to obscure, for example, certain problematic origins of wealth and money. So anonymity is a good thing, and if there are ways of encouraging it, I would be definitely up for it.
Two really quick thoughts. One ordinary thing said about philanthropy is that it's an attempt to not provide in your self-interest, but provide for someone else's interests. And insisting upon attaching your name to, a donation, a building, whatever, seems quite obviously in your self-interest, not in the interest of others. That tells against the idea of a tax deduction for sure. But secondly, I just want to offer what I think kind of standard issue economists might say about this, which is that naming opportunities, even tax deductible naming opportunities, could set in motion a virtuous cycle of competition amongst donors to outdo one another. Oh my gosh, I see that the Cordelli wing of that building is really nice, but Cordelli's not so great. I'm going to make an extra larger donation for the other part of the building and call it after me. And that redounds to the benefit of all of us because we're competing over our social status, not through buying houses and cars, but through philanthropic contributions. That would be the story on behalf of tax deductions for naming rights.
Great. Does the government and markets serve to satisfy needs when philanthropy serves to satisfy wants in society?
I would agree. I would say yes, but in an ideal society. So if you ask me what's the role of philanthropy in an ideal society, is that in an ideal society, there will be plenty of space for you to discretionally give to all the beautiful things you care about. So you want to, you have your favorite, your understanding of what a great piece of art is. You can dedicate all the money that now you rightfully own because the scheme of social cooperation is fair and equitable, and you can be discretionary. And in fact, one thing often says that if you care about philanthropy, real philanthropy, you ought to care about just political institutions, because only when those institutions are just, that then you can really have space for discretionary philanthropy. But we don't live in that world, and so it's hard to think that in this world philanthropy could just be left to the satisfaction of wants, because again, to repeat the point, if really what you give is something that ought to be returned partly to society, then it's not really up to you and your wants to determine how that should be spent. And that's why discretionary philanthropy in this world, I think, shouldn't have much of a role.
Great, thank you, Chiara. So our next question, your criticisms of philanthropy are focused on social injustice and the alleviation of inequality and poverty. How does philanthropy for arts and culture fall into this category?
Well, picking up Chiara's response to the last question is one way of thinking about that, that in a world in which there are basic needs that go unmet, it would seem that philanthropists are called to try to redress them, whether it's through philanthropy or, as Chiara has suggested, through a kind of reparative aspiration for the background structure of institutions that created the distribution in such an unfair way in the first place. And, finding ways to justify philanthropy for things that don't count as basic needs, not attaching to, correcting for social inequalities, can leave the philanthropist open to criticisms that they're basically pursuing their frivolous preferences. When you see in Chicago or San Francisco, next to the Opera House, extraordinary homelessness and great need, and yet the donors are giving to support the opera, the criticism made of the donor, of course, is you're choosing the wrong cause. What's wrong with you in prioritizing the opera over people who are so desperate for assistance? And what Chiara has said is, in a world in which these background institutions are fair, first, we won't see the basic needs at all. And then we open up a space for philanthropists to care about luxury goods or the idiosyncratic preferences. You like the opera, I like table tennis, and we each fund our own little local institution to satisfy these things. So, in certain respects, the answer I want to give to this question is, how is the funding of these things that aren't basic needs, that aren't correcting social inequalities, trying nevertheless to grapple with, if you agree that these are background injustices, well, then what then are you doing, dear donor, about that? We each are striving for a world in which funding non-basic needs, which is, say, luxury goods, arts and culture, would be beneficial. But we're called, perhaps by priority, to care about the most urgent needs in front of us. And those rarely will turn out to be things like the museum. That's a depressing story for anyone in the audience who's attached to a museum. And you think, oh my gosh, what am I now supposed to do? That's all that basic justice and basic needs are all that matter. That can't possibly be the answer. From a moral standpoint, the grip this begins to hold on you, I think, is hard to resist.
Great. Well, switching gears to higher ed, can you comment on donor influence, particularly in higher education, where donors want to define the type of student who can receive a scholarship, or when they want to direct or influence faculty hires or curriculum changes?
Yeah, as it happens, just today or yesterday, Yale University announced the creation of a committee, faculty and staff committee, to investigate the terms on which Yale would receive donations because of a scandal that happened last year where a donor was heavily involved in the substantive content of a program that had been funded. And to pick up a term that we haven't used today, but that often comes up in conversations about philanthropy, it's one thing for a philanthropist to fund a program of his or her choosing. It's another thing on top of it to act so paternalistically that they want then to direct every aspect of what's done with the program. And of course, that's the great worry in university life, is that the donor can select amongst the whole array of things that go on at a university, but then further want to specify the faculty member that gets hired, the curriculum that gets used, the particular student who receives the aid, which would completely eliminate the autonomous decision-making of the university itself if all it ever did was have singular donor contracts with people who then specified how the university was meant to operate. So paternalistic donors undermine the self-determination or agency or independent decision-making authority of the recipient organization. And so heavy paternalism has to be resisted. And I think that's essential in university life in particular.
Yes, and I think that this fact mirrors at a micro level at the micro level, what's the macro level problem with democracy, right? Fundamentally, you start living in a society where some classes get more and more used. So it becomes really a habitus, like a way of being that gets you to call the shot in a lot of social contexts. And you might think one person like this, maybe nothing happened, although formally that would still be a problem because there would still be an equal distribution of authority, but you might think it's not a problem. But when you start, when this goes hand in hand with social stratification, then really you start wondering, right, what's the difference between a society like this and an oligarchy? What is the difference between this society and this sort of a more kind of feudal order, to be a bit dramatic, where just one class gets to decide how the home, I mean, what should be a home, right? Society should look like. And I think this is a problem. On education, I also would like to say something else. I've always, and this is an open question to me, but wonder whether there is a difference between higher and compulsory education. Because also compulsory education, you might think as a very important communicative role, right? One of the purposes is to form the citizens of the future. So if you think that compulsory education is necessarily also civic education, then an education where the voices of private philanthropies are amplified in the way the curriculum should look like, or what should be taught and how, then it really becomes an education that is unable to deliver a civic message in the name of all. And that's no longer, I would call it a civic form of education. And so the problem is even deeper at the level.
So our next question is about philanthropists and being liable for their undesirable outcomes. For instance, Brad Pitt starting a foundation to build low-cost home after Katrina in New Orleans, when 10 years later, the houses are falling apart. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, here I guess I'm inclined to say something like, there's two ways to think about liability for a philanthropist. One is in a legal sense. The philanthropist uses some resources to build housing in Brad Pitt's cases, but that are no longer around. It was worse than a mistaken judgment, but the question arises whether the philanthropist should be legally liable. I'm not a lawyer, but I'm inclined to worry about that as an approach. But if we're just talking about moral liability, a form of complicity, a failure of adequate foresight, an indifference to the longer-term potential bad outcomes of a gift and claiming all of the short time horizon benefits of the gift, there a donor can and should be held morally liable and open to criticism. I'll add here that one of the other things that I find in the world of actually existing philanthropy and charity quite troublesome is the idea that the social dynamic that attaches to philanthropists is that there's a strong expectation of praise and gratitude from anyone who's been a recipient. And so if it should turn out that donations go badly in any way, nevertheless, the donor often appeals to the fact that he or she could have spent the money on something for their own interest, but they at least tried to give money away to help others. And so even if it didn't work out, you shouldn't criticize me. I'm sorry it didn't work out, perhaps, but surely this was better than just keeping it for myself. That kind of background framework immunizes philanthropists from the kinds of criticisms that not only are appropriate from a moral point of view, but also, I should add, prevent donors from engaging in a kind of learning feedback loop. Because if you wish to improve your philanthropy, you should be open to hearing forthright criticism and feedback from donors and citizens, instead of just expecting gratitude and praise.
I think I'll go for one more question. What about the role of philanthropy in trying to address longer-term issues like environmental issues? Isn't there a role for philanthropy to address longer-term problems that are real threats to long-term welfare for society?
I leave the answer to Rob because I think this is at the heart of his long-termism argument for this.
Yeah, that's right. So my own view about democracy, as came out in our earlier exchange, is that democracy by design, not as a flaw, but by design is oriented towards short time horizon decision-making. To think about climate in particular here, if a politician says, we're going to spend a whole bunch of taxpayer dollars on some completely experimental technical solution to climate change, but we have no idea if it will work, but it's worth a try. And then in 2 years, 4 years, or 6 years, when the politician is up for election and people ask, well, how did you spend the money and what do we have to show for it? The answer is nothing yet, and it might not even work 10 years from now either. That's a recipe for losing the election. So this short-termism that's built into democracy and democratic decision-making as a design feature makes it more difficult for democracies to be the proactive agent of longer time horizon problems, solving longer time horizon problems. So I think there is a strong case for philanthropists to try to tackle long time horizon stubborn problems like climate change, for example, in order to pilot potential solutions that could be then scaled up either by the market or by government itself once they're demonstrated to be successful.
Although what I would quickly add is that even if all this is, I think, very reasonable, it doesn't eliminate some of the concerns we talked about earlier, and I think it doesn't preclude the fact that, however, the process of discovery, innovation, decisions about where to invest this money, to what kind of environmental experiment, should not itself be rendered more inclusive. Mm-hmm. So you could agree that philanthropy should play this kind of role and still agree that the way this decision ought to be made ought to be less private and more public, right? Mm-hmm. To some extent.
Well, I want to thank you, Rob and Chiara, for what was a truly demanding and challenging and insightful and energizing all at the same time discussion. One of the reasons that we believe so passionately in lifelong learning at UChicago and at Stanford is that it's one of the keys to living examined lives of purpose. And one of the opportunities that I think higher education affords is to take a step back and really ask some of these systemic factors that we take for granted. I think it's very easy to sit back and just say, wow, look at that gift. This must be a wonderful human being. And it's not to say they're not, but it's to say that it happens in a context. And we have to examine that context and the systems and not just take it at face value. And I'll just share that in my own intellectual journey, I remember coming from privilege, getting to university, reading Amazing Grace by Jonathan Kozol. And that was our kind of 1 year or first year book that everyone read together. And I remember being struck by that book. And one of the quotes I most remember, there's a character in the South Bronx, not a person in the South Bronx, but kind of a character in the book, so to speak. And he asked, do you think people in Manhattan care? And she replies, if they do, I don't know why they have to dress up in black tie every time they give money. And it was a striking comment, and it began to kind of just raise some of those moral questions, right, that are reinforced by political philosophy and by some of the human experiences that you both described. And so I just want to thank you both. I think you're raising really important questions. Obviously, they're questions that point in our own direction, right? So we look in a mirror, we say, how are we in higher ed? How are we in all these other institutions thinking about the role of philanthropy, and how can we ultimately redeem it? I think is the provocative question that we're all left with, and you've given us some really interesting tools to answer that. So thank you both again, and looking forward to continuing the conversation and looking forward to continuing the series with Stanford. Have good afternoons, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.